Inequality in its various shapes and forms is at the center of discussions in the political, popular, and academic sphere. This is why this year, the UBS Center Forum for Economic Dialogue decided to hold a four-part event series about rethinking inequality. My name is Nir Jaimovich. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Zurich, and I'm affiliate professor with the UBS Center for Economics in Society. We're going to have something called a research slam. This is the idea. We're going to have 7 speakers who will try to summarize years of research about an inequality project in 5 minutes. 7 times 5, 35 minutes. So if you stick with us for 35 minutes, an average Netflix episode, you're going to learn a lot about inequality. I hope you can join us. Okay. Our first speaker is going to be Silja Häusermann from the Department of Political Science at the University of Zurich. Silja.
Good afternoon. Rising inequality in the knowledge economy has become a mega topic both in academia and in politics. And as a political scientist, I am mainly interested in the political consequences of this development. Now, a lot of debates have suggested a direct link between inequality and the rise of radical parties in our democracies. And so today I present just a few empirical observational findings from ongoing work on this topic, and this is joint work with Delia Zollinger and Thomas Kurer. So the simple direct hypothesis linking rising inequality to the increasing vote shares of radical parties argues that actual objective resources of voters are key. Lower income voters are more likely to vote for radical parties, higher income voters are more likely to vote for mainstream parties. But research has soon managed to show that this is not the main story, and these studies have looked into a variety of aspects of economic circumstances of stratification. So not just income, also class, occupation, unemployment, etc. And today, on the basis of all this research, we know that the objective circumstances that people experience are not sufficient to understand how people, in their minds, establish the link between inequality and political choice. So that was the first slide that you were supposed to see while I was speaking, but you see it now. So this is the topic, inequality and the rise of radical parties. So how do people construct this link between inequality and political choice? How do they establish a link between their own subjective perception of their situation in a context of increasing inequality and the political claims that they support? In our project, we study how people evaluate their prospective opportunities on how well they are going to do in the knowledge economy. So concretely, we conducted surveys in 8 European countries. We asked 12,000 citizens in these countries, and we asked them to indicate how they perceive their own chances and the chances of their children to succeed economically and socially over their life course. And we see indeed that the more confident voters are about their future opportunities, the more likely are to support mainstream parties as opposed to radical parties, both left and right. Now, you may argue that this may still show a divide and vertical economic divide based on resources, because we do know that, especially in the knowledge economy, actual prospects for income and status are very tightly linked to levels of education and social class. So therefore, it's important for us to show that there are sizable groups of voters for whom their subjective perception of opportunities does not align with their actual economic situation. And this is actually what we see. So for instance, we have in the entire sample almost 24% of respondents who have above average incomes, but are very negative in evaluating their prospective economic opportunities. And we have almost 15% of voters who have quite high, we have 23% of voters who are rather low income, but have a confident, positive evaluation of their opportunities in society. So these two groups, the 23% of what we call aspirational voters, more confident voters, despite their economic circumstances, and the 15% more apprehensive voters, who are skeptical about future opportunities are, of course, analytically most interesting. We are still in the process of figuring out what drives exactly these perceptions, but we already know that they are very relevant to understand political dynamics. So what you see here are predicted probabilities of voting for particular party groups. And the colored stars that you see are deviations from average levels of support. These findings are from Germany, but they hold across the countries. And what you see is that these aspirational voters are more likely to support mainstream parties, especially mainstream right parties, mainstream left parties, and the more apprehensive voters are more likely to support radical parties, especially radical right parties, and that is a specific finding for higher income apprehensive voters. There are many implications of this research, and I would like to conclude here by pointing out just two. The first implication is that the political dynamics stemming from these developments, of course, depend on the relative size of these groups. And so, for instance, in Southern Europe, we find almost 60% of people being quite negative on the evaluation of their future opportunities, whereas this share is only about 30% in the Nordic countries. So we see that the evaluations are more positive where the transition to the knowledge economies has happened in a more socially inclusive way. And the second implication concerns policy. Inequality is threatening mainstream politics where people fear that they and their children will not be able to keep up. So addressing these inequalities politically requires investing in the chances of people to build good lives for themselves and for their children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Florian Scheuer, and as many of you probably know, the share of income and wealth going to the very richest group of households has been increasing dramatically over the last couple of decades in many countries. And so there's been quite some discussion in many countries about whether the super rich still pay their fair share of taxes. And as a result, politicians have proposed to increase the tax burden on these households, both in the form of higher marginal tax rates on existing income taxes. So for instance, AOC's proposal in the US to have a new 70% marginal income tax bracket on incomes in excess of $10 million a year, or in the form of new tax levies targeting the super rich. So most prominently, the former presidential candidates Warren and Sanders have proposed to introduce a new wealth tax in the US at very progressive rates, up to 8% per year in Bernie Sanders' proposal. Now, when it comes to the super rich, the first thing I want to emphasize here is that they're qualitatively different from the rest of us. For most of us, the bulk of our income is just labor income. But at the very top, capital gains become incredibly important. So what you see in this graph, for instance, is that for households that make more than $10 million a year, almost half of their income is in the form of realized capital gains. And if you just focus on the 400 households that reported the highest income, for instance, in 2016 in the US, more than 60% of their income was realized capital gains. Now, why does that matter? Well, capital gains are treated very favorably by most countries' tax system currently. So an extreme example is Switzerland. We don't even have a capital gains tax. But even in other countries that do have one, such as the US, capital gains are taxed at lower rates than ordinary labor income. And they're only taxed based on realization. So for instance, if you never realize these capital gains during your lifetime, they also completely escape taxation. And so in our work here, joint with Joel Slamrod, we estimate that just because of this last provision, about half of total capital gains never get taxed, even in the US. And so you see that taken this together with this extreme concentration of capital gains at the very top means that the tax system becomes regressive as we go up the distribution. So there can be very rich individuals with very high income who face a relatively low tax rate. Now, how could we fix this and restore some tax justice at the very top? Well, one proposal we've seen is to have a wealth tax. And here in Switzerland, we're actually a big exception. We already have a wealth tax in place. Most other countries don't. And the first thing to keep in mind here is that a wealth tax conceptually is tightly linked to a capital gains tax. So for instance, if we all have a 4% rate of return on our wealth, then a 2% wealth tax is nothing else than a 50% capital gains tax. If we all just have a 2% rate of return on our wealth, then of course a 2% wealth tax is like 100% capital gains tax. So you already see from this comparison that a wealth tax really favors people who have high rates of return on their wealth, and it really hits hard those who are just inactively sitting on their wealth and don't have any good ideas what to do with it, so they have low rates of return. Now, on the other hand, what we think is that a big chunk of what shows up as capital gains, in fact, is compensation for labor. Let me give you a little example. Think about the founders of a startup company. These startups early on have very little cash, so most of the compensation is typically in the form of shares rather than wage salaries. And so these founders work for a couple of years, and if they're successful, there will be some exit, some acquisition or some IPO, and they will realize capital gains at that point because the shares will be worth a lot of money. Now, if you think about this from an economic standpoint, this is really just the compensation for the labor effort that they've exerted during these first few years of the company. And because a wealth tax is a unit tax on the rate of return, say a 2% wealth tax just hits the first 2% on your rate of return, it doesn't target any of these excess returns that you get, for instance, from shifting your labor income into capital gains, which really also should be taxed. And a wealth tax fails to do that, but a capital gains tax would still capture at least partially these excess returns. So we think that this shifted labor income story has become more and more important over time. And so in our view, the way to go forward is actually to just fix capital gains taxation. There's no rule of law that says that they must be tax favored. We could easily have another system where we tax them at similar rates as labor income, where we remove all these other benefits that they currently benefit from, and that would allow us to restore tax progressivity at the very top, which I think an increasing share of our society really cares about. Thanks a lot.
My name is Ernst Fehr, and I'm speaking about patience, parental wealth, and wealth inequality. I'm presenting you a study I did with these co-authors on this slide. And let me start with an observation that is widely known. The observation involves the distribution of wealth in various countries. And what you see here on this graph is the distribution of wealth in Europe and the United States over time. So in the year 1910, 10% of the top wealth owners in Europe owned about 90% of the wealth in Europe. And the numbers in the US are slightly lower, but still similar. In the year 2010, this wealth inequality has been substantially mitigated, but is still high. For example, in Europe, in the US, 70% of the wealth is owned by the top 10%, whereas in Europe it's about 65%. However, today I don't want to talk about the richest people. I want to talk about the other people, the remaining 90%. And I want to ask the question, how is wealth distributed in the remaining population, in the remaining 90%? And I also ask the question, why is this important to know? And finally, I will tell you a little bit about how important patience, education, and parental wealth is for an individual's position in the wealth distribution. My study is based on Danish data because Denmark is a paradise for researchers because we have very precise wealth data, and we also were able to have a very precise measure of patience, parental wealth, and education. So why is the wealth distribution among the rich, among the less rich, among the remaining 90% important? Well, there are two reasons for that. Both are related to the severity of economic recessions. If wealth were distributed equally in the remaining 90%, recessions would be much less harmful. And the reason is as follows. If wealth would be distributed equally, people would have the opportunity to compensate for their income losses during a recession by drawing on their savings. they could draw down on their savings and they could build up the savings in the next boom. But when wealth is very unequally distributed, this is much less possible. And if people could draw on their savings during a recession, they would also maintain their consumption, and the recession would be much less severe because demand for consumer goods would stay high during the recession. So recessions in an unequal society are typically much deeper, and they are more harmful. And there's strong empirical evidence, for example, that the Great Recession in the US in 2009 was to a large extent also driven by the inequality in wealth. So what is the share of the bottom 50% in our Danish population? What you see here in the bottom graph is that the bottom 50% basically have very little wealth. Their share in total wealth is typically 5% and sometimes less over time, whereas the middle 40%, they own about 50% of the wealth, and the top 10% also own about 50%. Now, Denmark is a very egalitarian country, and despite this high level of equality, we still see a substantial level of inequality in wealth. So that implies that even for the Danish society, which is very egalitarian, because of the unequal distribution of wealth in the bottom 50%, recessions are pretty harmful unless the state has a social insurance system that mitigates the harm that is done by economic recessions. And finally, how important is patients' education and parental wealth for the position in the wealth distribution of the different people? What you see here in the far most left graph, the colored graphs, is the effect of patience. And by patience, we mean how willing people are to save money now in order to have more in the future. And it's natural that people who are patient will accumulate more wealth because they have more savings. The same holds for education. Educated people have higher incomes and therefore more possibilities for savings. And of course, if you have inherited a lot of wealth from your parents, you also have more wealth. Now, when you look at the relative role of these three factors, you see that those with the lowest patience, they are on average located in the 46th percentile of the wealth distribution. This is an average number of those with low patience. Those with the highest patience, they are on average located in the 54th percentile of the wealth distribution. So when you go from low patience to high patience, then that means that you gain 8 percentiles in the wealth distribution. When you compare that with education, you see it's very similar. Education is the middle graph here, the gray bars. And when you compare this with parental wealth, you see that parental wealth is roughly twice as important as the other two factors. Why? Because the people who inherit very little in the lowest tercile of parental wealth distribution, they are on average located on the 42nd percentile, and they go up to the 58th percentile. So you gain 16 percentiles if you go from the lowest parental wealth to the highest parental wealth. And that shows that parental wealth is twice as important for your position in the wealth distribution compared to the other two factors. So let me summarize. Wealth is very unequally distributed in society. Most of wealth is owned by the top 10% wealth owners. But the wealth distribution in the remaining population is also very important because wealth inequality aggravates the harmful effect of recessions. And since the bottom 50% own relatively little wealth, they have only limited opportunities to compensate income losses during recessions. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, I'm Elisa Macchi, and today I'm going to present you my research on the benefits of obesity in low-income countries. Differently from what we observe in Switzerland or in the United States, in most developing countries, obesity is more widespread among the wealthy. This graph shows you the distribution of obesity by income quintile in low-income countries. As you can see, the share of obese people in the highest income quintile, that means among the wealthiest, is about 7 times as large as the same share in the bottom income quintile, that is among the poorest. Now, we tend to think that wealth causes obesity. This is, for example, because in low-income countries, the price of high-calorie food is extremely high. However, what I'm going to show you today is that actually obesity in itself can cause wealth, because obesity leads to monetary benefits in economic interactions in low-resource settings. Now, why is this the case? So the problem is that in low-income countries, reliable information about wealth is scarce. You can imagine that 60% on average of people in developing countries don't own a bank account. That means that for them, it's impossible to present a document as simple as a bank statement. Now, in this context, the information, the wealth information provided by body mass becomes extremely important and can be exploited as an informal wealth verification technology in economic interactions. This means that obesity leads to economic benefits. How can I test for this mechanism? I work in the urban area of Kampala in Uganda, and I test for economic benefits of obesity in the context of credit. I work with 124 financial institutions providing credit in Kampala. I directly cooperate with their loan officers, and I ask them in my experiment to evaluate a set of hypothetical loan applications, which include the portrait of the borrower. This is complete standard practice in Uganda. Now, my aim is to understand whether loan officers are more lenient towards obese borrowers. But if I would just look at standard loan applications, the problem would be that I wouldn't be able to identify the causal effect of obesity, because obesity correlates with many other factors. And this is where this photomorphed portrait comes in handy. So, starting from the portrait of each starting from the borrower's portrait, as you can see in the center graph, I create, with the help of 2 photographers, a lower body mass version and a higher body mass version, so that is an obese portrait. For each loan application, when the loan application is evaluated by the loan officer, I randomly assign whether the loan officer sees the borrower in its normal weight version or in its overweight version. This allows me to test for the causal effect of obesity, all else equal. That is, what happens when a loan application is evaluated by loan officers and this loan officer sees the borrowers in its higher body mass version relative to the loan officer seeing the borrower in its lower body mass version. My results show that obese borrowers have easier access to credit. That means the very same application, when associated to an obese borrower, is more likely to be approved by the loan officers. This graph plots the loan officer's approval likelihood over the borrower's body mass index. As you can see, approval likelihood is increasing in the borrower's body mass, and in particular, it's highest for severely obese borrowers. This implies the 2 things. And the first thing is that obesity benefits distort credit provision in developing countries. But on the other hand, it implies that in developing countries, there are monetary incentives to be obese, and such incentives should be taken into account when thinking about obesity prevention policies for low-resource settings. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, I'm David Hémous. I'm going to talk to you about automation and wages, a two-way street. What do I mean by this? Well, we know that automation has consequences on labor markets, so for wages, employment, and so on. This is kind of the black arrows that you see here. But we should also expect labor market conditions to affect automation. In particular, we should expect higher wages to lead to more incentive to undertake automation. So what we're going to do here is really trying to measure how big is the size of this red arrow, because there's been little research on that before. Now, to do that, we need to first solve a challenge, which is measuring innovation in automation technologies. So we're going to do that by looking at patent data, and we're going to develop our classification of patents as representing either automation innovation or non-automation innovation in machinery. Once we've done that, we're indeed going to check that indeed it is a case that sectors where most of machinery patents are associated with automations also experience a decline in routine tasks. Okay, so that's kind of validating our measure of automation. Now, the second challenge to establish, the size of this red arrow is that there is, of course, because there is also the black arrow, you have a problem of reverse causality. Okay, so you cannot just do cross-country regression and measure whether places with higher wages are places with also higher automation, because we also know that automation affects local labor market. So to solve for this, what we're going to do is that we're going to use firm-level patent data and labor cost data from 41 countries between 1995 and 2009. And for each firm, we're going to measure what is the average wage that their customers are exposed to. So why are we thinking about the customers of firms here? Because the firms that are introducing these automation innovations are typically equipment producers. And so they're selling their machines, their robots to other firms. And what we would expect is that, well, the customers of, say, Siemens or Robert Bosch are going to ask for more automation-intensive machines if the wages that they face are higher. Now, we're going to compare how firms are exposed to different countries. So how does that work? Well, for instance, it may be that Siemens tends to sell more to Japan than Robert Bosch, in which case an increase in Japanese low-skilled wage will be associated with additional patents in automation for Siemens relative to Robert Bosch. And this is kind of this effect that we're going to measure. What do we find? We find very large effects. So we find that a 10% increase in low-skilled wages is associated with around 20% more innovation in automations. Okay, so you can see this in this graph. So this graph shows the blue line is the data, so that's the share of patents in machinery that are associated with automation. And then we plot a counterfactual, which is what would have happened if low-skilled wages were higher by 10%. And so you can see that that would have shifted to a higher share of automation patents. The second exercise that we do, which is closely related, is trying to measure the effects of the Hartz reform in Germany. So the Hartz reform in Germany tried to increase labor supply, and particularly low-skilled labor supply, with the effect of reducing low-skilled labor cost. Now, what we're going to do is that we're going to look at the effect of this reform on non-German firms, which were, however, more or less exposed to the German market. Okay? So what we're going to plot essentially in what you see here plotted is what is the additional amount of automation innovation relative to non-automation innovation undertaken by firms when they're more exposed to the German market. Okay? And the graph depicts a story where from 2000 to 2003, firms which are highly exposed to Germany were doing more and more automation, but after the implementation of the Hartz reform, this trend completely reversed. So what are the consequences? Well, first, if we expect wages to be a factor behind automation, then we should think that since wages on average increase, automation over time should increase. Indeed, this is what we find in the data. We find that over time, the share of innovation in machinery, which are associated with automation, has risen, particularly in the most recent years. So this is what's plotted in this graph with two different measures of automation. What does it mean if we have an increase in automation? Well, that means first that we should see a decline in the labor share, which is also something we've observed in the data, and a rise in income inequality,
given that automation tends to substitute low-skilled workers more than high-skilled workers. Also something we've observed in the data. What does this mean for policies? Well, for policies, it means that redistributive policies that try to achieve the same goal may have very different effects depending on their effect on labor cost. A policy such as a higher minimum wage is going to increase labor cost and therefore should be associated with more automation. So, fancier and more robots in these pictures. While policies that try to reduce labor costs, for instance, the health reform, a negative income tax credit, or increase the cost of a robot compared to the cost of labor, such as a robot tax, should be associated with less automation, namely less fancy and fewer robots. Thank you.
My name is Ulf Zölitz, and I will talk to you about inequality in educational opportunity. Education is a key opportunity in society. So if you obtain more education, you will have higher earnings later on, but you will also have other better outcomes. You will have, on average, better health. You're going to be less likely to be involved in risky behavior, less likely to be involved in crime. And there's even some evidence suggesting that if you obtain more education, you're going to live a happier life, you're going to have higher subjective well-being. So in this work that I'm going to talk about today, I will show you the results of a long-term intervention showing you how kids are affected by an intervention taking place early on in primary school. I will show you that we can increase educational opportunity if we intervene early on. So why should we care about inequality of opportunity? First of all, because it's really unfair. So when same ability children are tracked into different secondary school tracks because of their parents' socioeconomic status, that really seems something that is unfair to us. So if you look at two kids in Swiss primary schools who have identical test scores, identical grades, you actually observe that those who come from an academic household are 2 times more likely to end up in the academic high school in gymnasium. So what we do in this paper, we ask, can we level the playing field if we intervene early on? So the intervention that we study actually took place here in Zurich in 2001-2, and in this intervention, kids from 26 randomly selected primary schools received this intervention targeting socio-emotional, non-cognitive skills. Now, these schools were randomly selected, and what we're going to do is we're going to compare those children in these schools where the intervention was implemented with other kids at other schools that did not receive the program. We're then going to compare the educational trajectory and educational outcomes of both of these groups over time. What is this intervention about? The intervention targets socio-emotional skills. In particular, it targets self-control, patience, but also self-esteem. So what kids learn in this intervention is really to slow down their decision-making process and to make less impulsive decisions. Now, what do we find? Here, I'm showing you differences between those kids who received this intervention and those kids who did not. So what we see is that those children who received the intervention are systematically more likely to get tracked into academic high school, gymnasium, more likely to complete academic high school with a Matura degree, and they're also more likely to enroll in university later on. If we look at them at age 20, those kids who received the intervention, they're more likely to be in education or in some form of apprenticeship training. Now, who's driving these effects, and what about disadvantaged groups? So what we then did, we looked at heterogeneous effects. So we asked, are these intervention effects the same for different children who differ in their socioeconomic status? What we do find is that the intervention indeed increases educational opportunity. So what we find is that this intervention is more helpful for children who have unemployed parents, for children who have parents without a university degree, and for children who come from households with lower income. So what we see from this is that we can increase educational opportunity if we decide to intervene early on. Now, what I want you to take away from this presentation is that we can help disadvantaged children to reach their full potential if we decide to intervene early on, right? So if we decide that we do not want to provide these interventions early on, this is problematic because we might be missing out on a lot of potential, and we'll miss out on these young, talented individuals who might make important contributions to society and the economy. You can read up all the details of the paper here. Thank you very much.
Hey, it's me again. So 30 minutes later, we're almost about to finish, but in the next 5 minutes, I wanted to share with you some work I've been doing with my colleagues, Itai Saporta, Ekchen, Yaniv Levy, and Ofer Sethi, about universal basic income. So it seems nowadays we open the newspapers, we hear reports on the TV, and there is a lot of discussion about UBI, universal basic income. Okay, it's become prevalent in political discussions and media outlets, etc., etc. And I think part of the interest in this kind of question comes back to what perhaps David was talking a few lectures ago, a few talks ago, about we have this feeling that there is a structural transformation in the labor market, automation, globalization, etc. Okay? And despite the emergence of a UBI as a possible policy tool, our view is that actually there is an alarming gap in formal quantitative analysis. What will this do to the economy? Okay, just to give you a sense, UBIs, I'm sending you a check for an X amount every month, irrespective of what you're doing in the labor market. Okay. Now you might say, wait a second, why are you talking about this? We have read about different experiments in different places that then people got checks and kind of nothing happened. This is where we as macroeconomists say, well, it's a bit different to send a check to 100, 200 people, 5,000 people versus do it in an economy of 9 million people as Switzerland. And why? Because a check for 9 million people will have to be funded. Taxes. This goes back to kind of what Florian was talking about. So how do we do this? We cannot do an experiment with 9 million people. Let's see what happens. It's a bit costly. Okay. We're going to do what we do in macroeconomics, which is we're going to use a state-of-the-art macro model, try to quantify the impact on the economy on different aspects of it. So let me just give you a sense. Again, the crucial thing to have in mind is that these checks that we are all kind of happy to get need to be funded. So let me show you what will happen to the economy if you fund them with the taxes on labor. Okay. What you can see on the upper left axis is UBI as a percentage of GDP of output. Let's just concentrate in the one that says 0.1, 10%. Let's assume I'm sending you a check that amounts for 10% of GDP. Okay. This is going to have a disastrous effect on GDP. Okay, we're going to have a decline of about 12 to 13% in output, GDP output. How many bananas we eat? We're going to have 12% less bananas, which might be good for dietary reasons. But overall, we like to think that the more bananas we have, the better we are. Okay, and what's going to be the key mechanism that we're emphasizing in this paper is that because of the increase required in taxation, it's going to really reduce the return to two things: to work, going to be a big reduction in labor force participation, and also the accumulation of capital. At the same time, it's going to do what kind of people have in mind that UBI will do. It will reduce inequality, but it will come in a big cost to the economy. Okay. So I'm going to skip this because I know you're all quite tired by now. I'm going to show you that not all news are bad. Okay. So one way to think about if you still want to do a UBI, universal basic income, is actually you have to merge it with some type of progressive taxation. Okay? And the crucial element that by doing progressive taxation, basically, you're kind of tilting at the time of the tax schedule, what you can do is bring some of those people that I showed you 2 slides ago that were leaving the labor force, by basically making it a bit more attractive to them, you can bring them on back into the labor force. And by bringing them back into the labor force, you're actually going to also increase the incentive for people to accumulate capital. Okay, so let me just show you kind of an example here. Let's concentrate in the one that is the diamonds, UBI equals 0.7. That's kind of a 10% of the economy, just to give you a sense. Okay, you can see, I don't have really good news in the sense, we're going to have less bananas. GDP is going to fall. There is no way out of that, okay? Labor force will fall relative to the initial point, which is that benchmark. But we can, as we do more and more progressive taxation, we can bring it relatively back to where we were before. Okay, we will be able to reduce consumption. But what is kind of interesting, what progressive taxation can do, is actually it could relatively increase welfare. Okay, basically there is a trade-off here between the amount of the bananas and how we're going to spread them. That overall the welfare, in some way that we economists like to think about, will increase overall welfare. By the kind of the key message is that even in the best scenario that we consider, there seems to be that UBI experiments suggest that there are basically big cost to the economy. They're also telling us, because welfare is increasing, that there are big incentives to do redistribution in this economy. Okay? So the question is basically, can we find some other methods to do the redistribution, okay? Which again, our results suggest that there is a room for that there is a desire for that in the economy, but without imposing such a big effect on GDP, on labor force participation, and the economy overall. So this concludes our academic event today. This is the first in a 4-part series, as I mentioned at the beginning. Next week, we're going to have inequality, facts and consequences with my colleague David Dorn and other esteemed economists. Okay, that's going to be next week at 4 p.m. Zurich time. The week after that, you're going to see Florian again, that you have seen 15 years ago, talking about taxing the super rich. I highly recommend seeing that talk. It's a very exciting one. And then the last event will be with Nobel laureate Sir Angus Deaton about inequality in the future of capitalism. Okay, so that's going to be our next 4 weeks. After those 4 weeks, you'll know everything you need to know about inequality. You'll be ready to impress your friends over dinner with social distancing, of course. Okay. So I want to encourage you to follow us on social media. If you go to the UBS Center Forum webpage, there is all this information and a lot of hashtags and stuff that young guys like to do. LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. No, we don't have TikTok, but maybe by next week we'll have something like that. Okay, but I hope you enjoy this event. And obviously, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to post them in social media. Thank you so much.